You know, some instruments, that, you know, when you're putting them together, it's a bit like canvas art. You're painting, you know, you're an artist. The way you're assembling things or milling parts or anything like that. And I like looking at it that way because it also means that we don't have to unfairly compare ourselves to each other's art, that we understand that everybody's making their own thing. You know, it kind of takes the limitations off it. Unfortunately, some art doesn't come into being very easily. And we have a disaster. Now, the thing about disaster that I've learned throughout the course of my life, much through the educational component of passing time, you know, if enough time passes, you know, you kind of eventually start to gain the perspective to see why things had to go a certain way. You know, we can kind of refer back to the story of that I was told by my music teacher years ago about this kid who was going and taking piano lessons, and he goes and he takes piano lessons over and over again. And his teacher is really not enjoying it, and he's not really growing. And at one point, the teacher sends him home with a note and says, you know, your son has no musical talent. Please stop sending him to piano lessons. This is a pretty horrible thing to do to like a 10-year-old. You have to be a horrible person to do that, you know. But they did. And it was necessary, because the thing is that they didn't go back to piano lessons. Instead, they took up guitar. And that was Les Paul. So there are times where disaster in the moment is merely course correction in the timeline that we just don't understand yet. And maybe that's how I'm choosing to look at this, because, you know, I was going into this thinking I was going to make this very minty thing. I knew I was going to relic it a little bit, but the Watco bass that was inside and underneath continues to react every time you reintroduce new finish to it. No matter how much you level it, no matter how far down you get, if there is any Watco left in the mix, it will throw checking that is very difficult to manage right into the sheen of your work. And as I was shooting this headstock and just watching this thing check over and over again, no matter how many times I tried to correct it, I was very tempted to sand it down to bare wood and just start all over again. But then as I started wet sanding and cleaning it up, I kind of started to see the color come through and the depth come through, and I just started to realize, you know, maybe this isn't a disaster. Maybe this is just not what I planned. You know, I planned to have something that was, you know, look like it had been kept in a case. This thing just wants to look like hell. This thing wants to. It's throwing checking all over the place, and this is the type of development that we buy Watco for. We buy it because it breaks down fast. We buy it because it checks extraordinarily fast and it gets really reactive. Unfortunately, the Watco, when used in a thick density that is required for the glitter to encapsulate it, the appropriate angles to maximize its reflectivity, the thermic reaction is too excessive, in the same way that if you have too much fiberglass resin in a cup, it is concentrated together and it self-heats itself, and it hits, you know, kind of like a critical mass and flashes off too fast. And that's what the Watco is doing. So right now it's kind of a choice. Do I keep going or do I start all over? Okay, so one of the great things about this build is we're going to go for, you know, a light stress wiring on this. You know, it's kind of daunting. I've talked to some guys who will sit there and they're really great at woodworking, and then they're like, get to the electric bit and they, you know, kind of look at it in a state of confusion. But a lot of it's pretty straightforward. And now Epiphone, along with Gibson, have kind of taken the next logical step, maybe modernizing things. And it's kind of amazing that we didn't think about this earlier as builders or as manufacturers. Okay, so we've got 500K pots in here. Got a really good switch. I've actually already popped that out and kind of had a feel of it. Good to see that they've got some good stuff here. Doesn't look like switchcraft, but it's not bad. It's not bad at all. Okay, I want to show you guys this real quick, which is the quick connectors are really wide, and the channel here is kind of narrow that's underneath. It's wide where we did the fill, but there's a little round spot back here. So you can file that out a little bit, but what's actually easier than that is taking the quick connect and just folding it back and then putting a small piece of masking tape, as small as you can, to push all of this together. And it'll pop right through the hole, and then this way you don't have to sit there and try to wrestle with the thing for 6 hours. So we've got this, we're going to pull the tape off of these, and then we've got our bag of stuff right there. And, you know, we're going to just see how quick this takes. I don't think it's going to take long at all, but, you know, that's the joy of it. So, you know, it's just something, we're going to see how quick and easy this is. They're talking about quick and easy, let's see how quick and easy it is. Okay, so we've got everything buttoned up, and, you know, for my coffee hands and jittery fingers, it was a little fiddly, but not too bad. Couple things I want to talk about real quick. First off, didn't realize this. The listing that I had purchased didn't talk about it, but apparently this has got some push-pull knobs, and it looks like it's wired up as a coil splitter. I am totally okay with that. I'm not primarily a humbucker guy, although I do use them on some sessions. I seem to hover around P90s and single coils for the most part. So it's kind of nice that while this thing is waiting to get sold, that I can kind of putz around with it and see what the coil splitters are like. God knows if they're any good or not, but there's that. Unfortunately, there's a downside to that, which is this, that if I actually tried to put a cover on this, these are raised. They're just barely higher than this edge. So I've got two options here. I can go cheap seats, and I can use a series of bushings to bring the cover just slightly out. But it's kind of bush league stuff, you know, as my dad used to say from when he was in Australia. It's not really the best effort. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to put a routing bit on the Dremel and put a rig on top of this, and we are going to have to slightly route out the top of the landing where these are bolting down to. So we're going to take them all out again. Yay, fun. And then we've got to clean up the surface. But the push-pull thing, actually, I'm kind of stoked about because didn't really see that coming, and it does play back into what we were talking about in the last video, which is we want it to look vintage. We want to look like it's really got its tongue hanging out and like it's been everywhere twice. But what we don't want to do is create a lack of reliability. So it's kind of nice. It's like a little hot rod action going on there. You know, we've got something there that's, you know, it's hiding a card up its sleeve. It's one more trick that it can do, but it doesn't make it look different. It doesn't throw too much contemporary at the classic. It doesn't throw too much contrast at the unity of the uniformity of the design. Okay, so we're up to the part where we've got to drop the bridge in. Luckily enough, that bad boy came in today. And we've got that lead that's down there. But the only thing is that this has got a lot of plating on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit it with a little bit of 800 around the edge. I find that sometimes the plating they use on these has a tendency of making connections a little bit touchy. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take this spring right here, stretch it out a little bit. And we're going to go ahead and apply a bit of pressure and then work this back and forth until it breaks. So we've got this guy. We're going to go ahead and drop him in there. Okay, so as we get to this point of the build up, this is where things start to get more fun, because everything looks kind of bad when you've got it apart. You know, when you've got just a bare body sitting in your lap, you know, there's so much attention to detail. You're so hyper focused on everything that you're going to pick apart all these little flaws in the same way that I do. Now, with this is one of those things that you kind of need part 2 to use part 3. Between the pickups and the bridge and the tailpiece, you should be able to align them all, essentially using a few straight edges, and then double check your measurements so that everything is as it should be. Now, there's a bit of liberty with these vibrolas that I kind of like, although I try not to use it, but it is nice that it is there, which is that this piece here is not actually fixed to the unit. It slides back and forth, and this is essentially your spring. It's kind of like a leaf spring on an old car, the rear axle of an old car. It uses that kind of cantilevered spring pressure, and this particular system, even more so than Strats and things like that, has a tendency of kind of staying in tune. Now, we've used a roller bridge here, which is nice. I'm going to put some oil on that. The movement's really good, and also the milling on the screws is really good. I'm going to put the link in the description on where this came from because the build quality on this particular bridge is a little bit better. I've also noticed that a lot of people are pushing the Epiphone style bridge attachments. You have to be careful what you order on these. These have a very shallow, very small anchor, which I kind of prefer because it doesn't stress the body if you set it up to rock during vibrola use. And you can see by the narrow pin style studs that is a Gibson style. If you order the Epiphone style, it'll come with huge tunematic studs, a lot like the stop bar tailpiece, and you'll have to try to rectify the actual timber around it to make it work. Now, when you're mounting one of these vibrolas, whether this be the long vibrola or whether this be the short one, you want to minimize space. I know that we've all kind of been toying with spaces and tailpieces lately, especially as people have started to do like the whole mount to pickup thing back there. I haven't done that yet, but you know, it's an intriguing method to try. I'd be willing to try it once. But on this, the stability of this tailpiece relies a lot on the shortness of distance and length. When you've got a string that is anchored here and is sitting right there, you're creating essentially a spring because each string is essentially just a spring under tension, a coiled spring with a solid core. The problem with multiplying space that a spring occupies is that you're creating more of a variation in its own tension. When the string is going from here to here, you simply have the expansive property multiplied by the distance between these two things. So if I were to actually move this all the way back here, what I have essentially done is created an environment in which now this string can be well within its tolerances to exercise a much more variable tension. Either way, that type of instability creates a situation where if you do use the vibrola at all, the eventual 0 point or settling space of the string and its tone might not be where you want it for that song. It might be way out of tune. So you want to move this bad boy all the way up, but leave yourself just enough space, because when this is loaded under tension, the bridge is going to be pushed further forward and this is going to start leaning down and in, which isn't a problem. But if it's up against that screw right there, you are, well, you're out of luck. The only thing we have to do now is worry about getting this particular piece aligned and set so that it doesn't have the strings going on an angle that would increase break angle and make the string either pop out of this saddle or make it just grab and not hold tuning. So here's the thing. Now that it's been a couple weeks and I'm coming back and I'm kind of looking at this and wrapping up editing on this video, and admittedly that's why the video was a little bit later, because man, I just wasn't sure how to get this thing going. I feel so two ways about it. One half of me really loves it and the other half of me is wondering if maybe I should go back and do it again. When you're staring at it for weeks, it becomes very, very difficult to maintain that perspective, to be able to look at things clearly. Even colors start to fade if you stare at them too long, because it's the polarity of juxtaposition, the contrast, that really keeps our senses in tune. So when you're staring at something for too long, after a while, you can't see it or hear it. It's like when you're in the studio and you keep listening to playback. After a while, you don't know if it sounds good. And it kind of brings up this point that Joni Mitchell had said when she was at Isle of Wight. Somebody was shouting, play Both Sides Now or something like that. And she turned around and she laughed it off and she said, nobody ever went up to Van Gogh and said, paint a starry night again, man. I just thought that was really great. And as a performing artist, yeah, you got to play the same thing over and over again. But, maybe refinishing this thing is just a bad idea, because it would be like paving over what this thing needed to be. What came about organically? What laid out naturally? All the good and the bad. you know, to repaint it again is, you don't do that. You know, you've painted it already. So I kind of feel like maybe I should let this thing out into the world to get beat up. But I don't know. You know, you guys put it down in the comments below. You know, sometimes it's hard to see stuff when you're staring at a project so long, you got to step away, you know, and then come back to it later on when you've got a clearer set of vision, you know. But was it a disaster after all? I don't think so. Maybe not.